I've avoided telling this story before because I want to believe that it wasn't real, that it was just a dream. But I've read so many similar encounters that I feel like maybe I should tell someone. Maybe it was real, and something like this really lives out there. I wish I would have known that it was possible back then. The story starts at my aunt's house. At the time, my mother and father were going through a divorce. I was about 11, and my younger sister was only 6. The details of the divorce don't really matter, but we were staying at my aunt's house with my mom until she could find a place that she could afford on her own. My sister and I were too young to fully understand, so for us, it was almost like a vacation. It helped that my aunt had a really cool house. It was big and seemed even bigger to a couple of young kids. I don't really know house lingo, but it was very modern, with 2 long main wings. One side of the house housed the bedrooms and a small library. The other had the kitchen. The kitchen had these huge windows, the kind lots of more modern-styled houses have, where they take up the entire wall. Nestled in this wall of windows was a sliding glass door, but my sister and I rarely used it because it was large and heavy and hard for us to open up. Another thing about these windows, though, was that they faced the woods. My aunt's house was surrounded right on the edge of a large wooded area. The trees ended only a couple of feet away from where the sliding glass door was. Of course, this was one of the benefits of her house. Living near the woods was so peaceful, or at least that's what my aunt always said. My aunt had a small sitting area by the windows where she could relax and watch nature. She told us that oftentimes she had had little herds of deer walk through, and that she had even seen a mountain lion once. Anyway, you get the idea. It was a big house with big windows and it sat close to the woods. For the majority of the time that we lived there, we had no issue. My sister and I would even go play in the woods, always making sure to stay within sight of the house. My mother would often sit in the sitting area by the windows, just to keep an eye on what we were doing. We would play hide and seek, or tag, or see if we could climb up the taller trees. Things changed at night, though. I hated those windows at night. When I would walk down the long hallway to the south wing of the house just to get a glass of water from the kitchen, I would always see the trees moving, swaying unnaturally. It wasn't like it was from the wind, though, where it started from the top and it would work its way down. But it was like something was pushing against them from below, and the tree shook from that. It freaked me out, but I was 11 at the time, so it wasn't that hard. I usually would just hurry up and get my water, and then run back to my room. I hated it so much that I rarely forgot to grab water before bed after the first couple of times. It wasn't worth risking that creepy stuff again. Later on, though, I wasn't really given a choice. One night, I had a dream that my mother had been calling me. Her voice was coming from where the kitchen was located, asking for my help with something. I stood up from my bed and made my way towards where she had called out, my brain still fuzzy from being asleep. Her voice was soft, but it carried to me as I walked, warm and familiar. The closer that I got, though, the weirder her voice began to sound. becoming slightly distorted and deeper. It was like a mix of my mother's voice with some animalistic cries that just got louder until I was shocked awake just before I stepped through the doorway into the kitchen. I quickly looked around, confused. My mom wasn't there, and the whole house was dark except for the moonlight that illuminated just enough of the room for me to know that it was empty. I shrugged it off as a sleepwalking dream, though I'd never had one before. So I turned around and I walked back to my room. A few nights passed before it happened again. This time, it was my father who had called for me. "Please," he called. "I need to talk to you. Come here." Just like last time, I stood up from my bed like in a trance, aware and unaware of what I was doing at the same time. Each step brought me closer to the kitchen, where I could hear my father's voice, it becoming more gravelly and broken as I walked closer. I stepped into the kitchen and thought that I saw him there, standing by the kitchen island, illuminated in the moonlight. And then he turned and looked at me, and I woke up, realizing there was nothing there after all. It took a few days again, but on the third night, I heard my little sister. She was crying for me, telling me that she hurt herself and that she needed my help. I stood up. I started hurrying to the kitchen, ever the big sister. But this time, I barely noticed when her voice had started changing, becoming a distorted gasp as I drew closer. I stepped into the kitchen and saw her. She was knelt, crying on the ground near the windows. I started to walk over to her, but stopped when I had realized something. She was kneeling behind the glass. She was outside. Her cries became a laugh and I startled awake, but I still saw a shape kneeled just outside of the window. Only it was bigger and dark and misshapen. I screamed in terror and it moved, faster than anything I had seen before, disappearing into the woods. My mother came running from her room, turning on my lights and comforting me. I told her about the sleepwalking and passing, so she chalked it all up to me, still having been asleep when I told her about the monster. She walked me back to my room and had me take some sleeping medicine just to help me get back to sleep. After that, everything seemed like it might finally be okay. A week passed and then two. My mom found a nice apartment and that she planned to move us all into. My sister and I were sad to leave my aunt's house, but at the same time, I was secretly relieved. I had basically been on edge every night since the events had happened, wondering if it would call for me again. But everything was silent until the night before we were meant to leave. I was just starting to drift off when I heard shuffling outside of my door. I froze, certain that the monster had returned for me, that it had somehow gotten inside of the house, and it was about to open my door. But the sound simply moved past me and down the hallway toward the kitchen. I stayed where I was, waiting to make sure it wasn't a trick, and then got up as quietly as I could and crept over to the door. I hovered, unsure if I should open it. After a few seconds, I made up my mind that I was going to run to my mom's room and wake her up. I slowly cracked open the door and I peeked into the hallway toward where these sounds were coming from. There, at the end of the hallway, and shuffling into the kitchen, was the form of my little sister. I blinked, and then squeezed my eyes shut and opened them up again, making sure that I wasn't asleep. But no, she was real, and she was disappearing into the kitchen right before my eyes. As I realized this, I realized that I could also hear something, a kind of faraway moaning whine coming from the direction that she was going to. Dread ran up my body, and I looked down the hallway at my mother's door, the opposite direction that my sister was walking. Fear told me to run and get her first, but instinct moved my feet towards the kitchen, where my sister had now gone out of my sight. I ran as silently as I could down the hallway and peered through the door to look for her. There she was. She was standing right in front of those windows, her eyes opened but glazed over. As I watched, I realized that the trees were swaying once again, the same way they used to, but much faster now. And the swaying seemed to be getting closer, moving towards us at an alarming speed. I could hear branches breaking and the trees creak in protest as something hit them, and the moaning whine that I heard from far away, it was getting louder, sounding like a dying animal. One tree was rocked so violently that a flock of birds flew screaming out of it, out into the night air. As this was happening, my sister was reaching out for something, the lock on the sliding door. Even at only 11 years old, I knew that something was coming through the woods towards us, and it was running, sprinting, right at my little sister. I ignored my brain screaming at me to run the other way, and I raced towards my sister. That noise was all-encompassing now. It had become a screeching so loud that it sounded like it was all around me. I grabbed my sister around the waist, pulling her back just before her fingers touched the lock, and I pulled both of us behind the wall beside the windows, just out of sight. The sound stopped. The trees no longer swayed, and the screeching had fallen silent. I could hear my sister breathing frantically, but I held a hand over her mouth and closed it, willing her not to cry. My own breathing was shallow and fast, but as I tried to quiet it, I realized that there was another sound. My sister's breathing, my breathing, and the even breathing of something else standing just outside the window next to us. A too large humanoid shadow blocked the moonlight that usually fell into the kitchen, and I watched the figure reach out its unnaturally long arm. I held my breath as I heard a scratch against the sliding door and saw the shadow of the creature's arm touch where the handle of the door was. After a second, the creature withdrew its arm and let it fall to its side. And then it stood there, still for what felt like hours. Finally, the shadow shrunk, and I could hear whatever it was leave. The underbrush rustled and the trees swayed, but the sound moved away this time instead of towards us. Still, I didn't move. I waited until all traces of its presence was gone, before I slowly pulled my sister away toward the hall, keeping out of sight of the windows as much as I could. My sister was crying as I led her down the hallway, and I think that I was squeezing her hand too tight, but I felt overwhelming relief as I opened the door to my mother's room and crawled into her bed. My mother never believed us, of course, and we moved away the next day. I refused to return to my aunt's house ever since, and she eventually too moved away. I've never had an encounter like that again, but that might be because I stay away from the woods like a plague now. If you're a fan of hiking or camping, or living near nature at all I can say to you is, good luck.